Well, before that, let's talk a little bit about business processes. We can think of business processes as a series of activities executed by businesses over and over again in the same way to achieve some tangible goal. Later in this part of the lecture, we'll be using an example from the banking world, and so I'll give you some examples of banking processes now. Those include things like opening a new customer account, and that's going to be our example later on, by the way. Accepting a customer deposit is another one. And mailing an account statement, that can also be a business process for a bank. These are considered business processes because they are repetitive. Banks perform these activities millions of times each day. They're done the same way every time, and they result in a small goal being achieved. The customer's account is now opened, or the customer's deposit has been accepted, and so on. Let me just mention, each of the example processes listed are customer-oriented here, but that is just by coincidence. There are tons of internal-only processes. It's just that I wanted to provide you with some examples that you are, somewhat familiar with as a probable bank customer. Some examples of things that are not business processes would be reviewing your email inbox, conducting a meeting, entering data into a system. Well, why not? Well, let's take them one at a time. Reviewing your email inbox is something that everyone does, hopefully, but it's performed differently by each individual, and that's fine. Organizations don't really care how you handle your email as long as you're doing it effectively enough. Conducting a meeting. Well, I can be funny and cynical and say that meetings don't have goals, but that's actually not true. No, conducting a meeting isn't a business process because they don't have the same tangible goal. They are conducted differently by each person, and each meeting is really unique. Finally, entering data into a system. I mean, it's not considered a business process, even though it's commonly handled the same way by most people, at least when done correctly. But generally, this is considered too small to be its own process. That said, data entry into a system is a very common part of a larger business process, and it's actually a part of the one that we'll cover in a little bit. So now that we've covered what business processes are, now let's talk about business process modeling and why we would want to do it. Usually there are three reasons why business process modeling is done. The first is to create a new business process. This means that there hasn't been a defined way to execute a certain process in the past, and so now we're going to design one. And this happens frequently when new products are launched by the organization or when new regulations are imposed on a business, that kind of thing. The second purpose is to improve an existing business process. These are typically incremental improvements. Someone in the organization believes that the current process can be improved in some way. Small changes to business process can sometimes be performed without modeling the changes, but it's never a bad idea to model a process before you implement it. Those situations, by the way, are generally called business process improvement, or BPI. And the third purpose is, I guess you can think of it as a kind of a combination of the first two. It's for those situations when there is an existing business process, but it needs to be substantially overhauled or even just redesigned from scratch. And typically that's called business process reengineering, or BPR. I guess the next question is why? Why would we want to analyze and model and change business processes in the first place? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I'll pick out just a few. I believe the most common is to reduce cost. It costs organizations a lot of money to operate, to run all these processes that they perform day in and day out. So if we can save money by operating more efficiently, we'll be able to compete more effectively in the marketplace. Another reason is to reduce cycle time. Cycle time refers to the amount of time it takes for an average instance of the business process to be executed. This in turn can improve customer service as it takes less time for the requests to be executed. It also can increase the efficiency of workers because they can do more work in the same amount of time. And it also reduces costs because Indeed, time is money. The final reason I'll mention is to improve quality. Automation is one of the main tactics of business process enhancement. When you automate a process, you are getting systems to do the work of people, oftentimes. And that means that you're hopefully removing some amount of human error from the equation. Don't think this is just a need of manufacturers, by the way, even though it started out in the manufacturing world. Just about every organization is dependent on the quality of its business processes. Earlier in this lecture, right at the beginning, I talked a little bit about the business process model and notation, BPMN. This is the type of modeling it's used for. And again, if you work on lots of process-oriented projects, I'll really encourage you to get to know BPMN as a next step. But we're not going to cover BPMN in this part of the lecture either. It's just a little bit too big for a fundamentals course. All right, let's now take a look at how business processes are formed. What goes into a business process? What are its components? I'm going to give you a slightly different view from what BPMN prescribes, just to keep things simple. You can think of any given business process as containing four components: actors, activities, information, and tools. Actors are exactly what they were in our discussion of use case modeling. They are the people and systems that do the work as part of the business process. Activities are the steps in the business process. You can think of these as task level, but sometimes an activity can be broken down further into more tasks and activities, and in that case it's considered what we call a sub-process. The third component is tools. These are the equipment or the other physical objects that are needed by any activity in the process to accomplish its purpose. This can include things like computer workstations, printers, barcode scanners, RFID readers. You get the idea. And the fourth component, last but certainly not least, is information. And this consists of data in whatever format. It can be electronic, it can be analog, essentially whatever format that's involved in the process. Information is really key to the modern enterprise. I know that economists have talked quite a lot in recent years about the shift into the information-based economy that the world's been undergoing for many decades now. Well, if companies or organizations don't manage their data well, they can be damaged quite a bit. And similarly, information flow is a big part of business process modeling. It's common for information to be transferred from one activity to another, for information to be entered into some kind of storage device, for information to be retrieved from storage, and so on. Not so different from data flow diagrams, if you recall those. Okay, enough talking about business process modeling in the abstract. Let's look at an example. And let's make this one a pretty fleshed out, detailed example that illustrates a lot of things. Okay, let's get started with that. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking at a simple model for how banks open new accounts for their customers. Don't worry if you are not familiar with banking. You don't need any particular knowledge here. Some of this you'll be able to relate to, perhaps from opening your own bank account. But don't worry about. We're not going to have any financial lingo or anything. Generally, with business process projects, when we're starting from zero, it's common to begin with interviewing the people that actually do the work in the current state of the process. So let's say that we meet with the bank teller, and she walks us through the process of opening an account. And she tells us, well, when the customer comes into the branch, they speak with me or one of my colleagues. They provide us with the documentation necessary to open the account. Then we open the account on the account system. Then we take their deposit. We provide them with a temporary debit card. And then after a week or so, they get their regular debit card in the mail. Well, hey, that's a great start. We've captured the process at a high level just from the information that the teller gave us. And we've kind of enumerated that as a list here on the screen. But we know as business analysts not to just take whatever stakeholders tell us. We have to make sure we have an accurate description of the process. So we'll probably ask some follow-up questions, like, are accounts only open from within the branch? Are there other ways to open accounts, perhaps online or over the phone? How does the customer know what documentation is required? Oh, gosh, that's a good one. What do you do with the documentation? How do you open the account on the account system? Can you demonstrate that for us? What forms of deposit do you accept? Is it checks, cash, money orders, electronic transfers? What is that? Another good one. How do you decide which temporary debit card to give to the customer? Do you mail the regular debit card to the customer, or does someone else? How does that process work? Okay, so this is just a sampling of the possible questions we can possibly ask. You could probably come up with a dozen more questions on your own. Well, let's say that the teller responds and gives us these answers. I'll put those on the screen. Well, let's go through her answers. To the first question, she says that accounts can only be opened in the branch, but she also mentioned that other banks let their customers open accounts themselves online. That's interesting. That might be a way that we can streamline the process from the perspective of the bank, at least, right? In her next answer, she mentioned a checklist. That's something we didn't know about before. And a checklist, by the way, sounds like a tool that we should consider in our analysis. In her next answer, she mentions that there is a file for each account and that they're kept in the cabinet in the back room. Then she showed us how to open an account on the system. Thank you very much. It's good to see how line employees process things like this. It's also good when we can get them to email us screen captures, by the way. That's another common tactic of business analysts. She then mentioned that they only accept checks, cash, and money orders. We might need that info later on. Then she described how temporary debit cards are chosen and assigned to the customer's account. That's good to know. Then she let us know that it's the back office that handles the regular debit cards. They're not handled in the branch. Finding out who in the back office performs that task and then having another interview with them would also be a good next step, by the way. Okay, great. So here's a bunch of additional information that she provided, and she didn't tell us that up front because she didn't know what level of detail we needed to have, right? So this is a great example of why it's important for us as business analysts to ask good questions. So let's now take a look at a cleaned up version of the information our bank teller has given us. First up, we know at least some of the actors. We don't have a whole picture yet, but it's coming together. We have the bank teller and the customer. They're the most obvious ones. But we also have the account system and a representative in the bank's back office as additional actors. Next, we have the activities and their sequence from the perspective of the bank teller. They're listed there on the screen. First, the teller determines the type of account. Then she determines the documentation required from the customer. Then the customer gives her the documentation. Then she creates the account on the system. Then she takes the deposit from the customer. Then she gives the temporary card to the customer. Then she files the customer documentation. And finally, the back office representative mails the new account package with a regular debit card out to the customer. Note that we're also matching the activity to the actor that is performing it. That's a really good check. And it's also going to help us out in a second when we put this in a diagram. After activities, we have the tools. We also know what tools are required to perform the work. Here I've listed about 5, but there could be more. Each of these tools represents something necessary to the process of opening an account. If any of the tools are missing, then we can't execute the process. Finally, we know what information is required to execute the process. I've only listed 2 here. The customer documentation, which is analog data, probably paperwork of some kind, and the temporary debit card number, which becomes digital data in the system. But there is certainly a lot more data involved in the process, of course, and in a real-life situation, we can spend a lot of time capturing that information. So, armed with this information, we are now ready to create a graphic process model for the open account business process. Since we're not using BPMN in this course, I'm going to use a particular type of flowchart which is helpful for processes with multiple actors. And it's called, you might have guessed it already, it's called the swim lane flowchart. And there you have it on the screen. I'm not going to go through the flowchart in detail. I think we can probably piece it together, by ourselves. But it's based on the 8 process steps that we just looked at. Being able to model business processes is a really important technique that needs to be part of every business analyst's toolbox. I really wish we had more time to go into the details of how it's done, but that's enough for now. I will mention that 7th Morning is coming up. I'm not sure if I mentioned this. We're coming up with a couple courses in business process modeling, an introductory course and a master's course, and I'll encourage you to keep an eye out for their release. Before we move on, just a couple asides. First, you might notice that there seems to be some overlap, or at least some commonality, between business process modeling and use case modeling. Well, if you notice that, then yes, you're right. The two modeling techniques are very compatible. It's just that use case modeling is usually performed on systems, and business process modeling is usually performed on business processes. Nonetheless, if you can do one, you can probably do the other. Second, we spoke about, now you have to search your memory, we spoke about various life cycles earlier in the course. Well, I mentioned that processes also have a life cycle. Well, this is kind of what it looks like. The first stages in the life cycle are analysis and design, where the business process is understood, analyzed, and described. Then we go on to model and test the business process. Then it's implemented in the organization. Then it's executed on an ongoing basis. And then eventually it's retired. The life cycle isn't so different from that of products, actually, although there is a wholly different mindset that's typically involved. Anyway, there we have it. That's business process modeling in a nutshell. All right. Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot of information in this section on transforming requirements. Before we close up here and move on to the next lecture, I'm going to offer a few pieces of advice. First, as you start modeling, get lots of input. Modeling can be very challenging, and there's a lot to it. And getting a second opinion is always a good idea. Second, just because you create a model or diagram, that doesn't mean that you actually have to put it in your document. You'll hear me saying this often later in the next lecture when we get to presenting requirements, and I'll give you some advice for how to handle those individually. Third, and perhaps the most important, don't expect anyone to understand your diagram at face value. Every diagram, just assume it needs to be explained, and we're going to cover that, how to do that in the course also. Okay, you've also probably noticed that different diagrams and models are used for different situations. Just to make it a little bit easier for you, I've included a cheat sheet that's part of this course's downloadable materials to help you figure out which tool to use when. And, well, I think that's it. All right, so that wraps up transforming requirements. Now we're going to move on to the next lecture, finalizing requirements.